What had the Lady Jessica to sustain her in her time of trial? Think you carefully on this Bene Gesserit proverb, and perhaps you will see. Any road followed precisely to its end leads precisely nowhere. Climb the mountain just a little bit to test that it's a mountain. From the top of the mountain, you cannot see the mountain. From Muad'Dib, Family Commentaries by the Princess Irulan.
At the end of the south wing, Jessica found a metal stair spiraling up to an oval door. She glanced back down the hall, again up at the door. Oval? She wondered. What an odd shape for a door in a house. Through the windows beneath the spiral stair, she could see the great white sun of Arrakis moving on toward evening. Long shadows stabbed down the hall. She returned her attention to the stairs. Harsh side lighting picked out bits of dried earth on the open metalwork of the steps. Jessica put a hand on the rail, began to climb. The rail felt cold under her sliding palm. She stopped at the door, saw it had no handle, but there was a faint depression on the surface of it where a handle should have been. Surely not a palm lock, she told herself. A palm lock must be keyed to one individual's hand shape and palm lines. But it looked like a palm lock. And there were ways to open any palm lock, as she had learned at school. Jessica glanced back to make certain she was unobserved, placed her palm against the depression in the door. The most gentle of pressures to distort the lines, a turn of the wrist, another turn, a sliding twist of the palm across the surface. She felt the click, but there were hurrying footsteps in the hall beneath her. Jessica lifted her hand from the door, turned, saw Mapes come to the foot of the stairs. "There are men in the great hall say they've been sent by the Duke to get young Master Paul," Mapes said. "They've the ducal signet, and the guard has identified them." She glanced at the door, back to Jessica. A cautious one, this Mapes, Jessica thought. That's a good sign. "He's in the 5th room from this end of the hall, the small bedroom," Jessica said. "If you have trouble waking him, call on Dr. Yui in the next room. Paul may require a wake shot." Again Mapes cast a piercing stare at the oval door, and Jessica thought she detected loathing in the expression. Before Jessica could ask about the door and what it concealed, Mapes had turned away, hurrying back down the hall. Hawat certified this place, Jessica thought. There can't be anything too terrible in here. She pushed the door. It swung inward onto a small room with another oval door opposite. The other door had a wheel handle. An airlock, Jessica thought. She glanced down, saw a door prop fallen to the floor of the little room. The prop carried Hawat's personal mark. The door was left propped open, she thought. Someone probably knocked the prop down accidentally, not realizing the outer door would close on a palm lock. She stepped over the lip into the little room. Why an airlock in a house? She asked herself, and she thought suddenly of exotic creatures sealed off in special climates. Special climate. That would make sense on Arrakis, where even the driest of off-planet growing things had to be irrigated. The door behind her began swinging closed. She caught it and propped it open securely with a stick Hawat had left. Again she faced the wheel-locked inner door, seeing now a faint inscription etched in the metal above the handle. She recognized Galak words, read, "O man, here is a lovely portion of God's creation. Then stand before it and learn to love the perfection of thy supreme friend." Jessica put her weight on the wheel. It turned left and the inner door opened. A gentle draught feathered her cheek, stirred her hair. She felt change in the air, a richer taste. She swung the door wide, looked through into massed greenery with yellow sunlight pouring across it. A yellow sun? She asked herself. Then, filter glass. She stepped over the sill and the door swung closed behind. A wet planet conservatory, she breathed. Potted plants and low-pruned trees stood all about. She recognized a mimosa, a flowering quince, a sondagi, green-blossomed plenicenta, green and white-striped acaso, roses. Even roses. She bent to breathe the fragrance of a giant pink blossom, straightened to peer around the room. Rhythmic noise invaded her senses. She parted a jungle overlapping of leaves, looked through to the center of the room. A low fountain stood there, small with fluted lips. The rhythmic noise was a peeling, spooling arc of water falling thud-a-gallop onto the metal bowl. Jessica sent herself through the quick, sense-clearing regimen, began a methodical inspection of the room's perimeter. It appeared to be about 10 meters square. From its placement above the end of the hall and from subtle differences in construction, she guessed it had been added onto the roof of this wing long after the original building's completion. She stopped at the south limits of the room in front of the wide reach of filter glass, stared around. Every available space in the room was crowded with exotic, wet-climate plants. Something rustled in the greenery. She tensed, then glimpsed a simple, clock-set servok with pipe and hose arms. An arm lifted, sent out a fine spray of dampness that misted her cheeks. The arm retracted, and she looked at what it had watered. A fern tree. Water everywhere in this room, on a planet where water was the most precious juice of life, water being wasted so conspicuously that it shocked her to inner stillness. She glanced out at the filter-yellowed sun. It hung low on a jagged horizon above cliffs that formed part of the immense rock uplifting known as the Shield Wall. Filter glass, she thought, to turn a white sun into something softer and more familiar. Who could have built such a place? Leto? It would be like him to surprise me with such a gift, but there hasn't been time, and he's been busy with more serious problems. She recalled the report that many Arikeen houses were sealed by airlock doors and windows to conserve and reclaim interior moisture. Leto had said it was a deliberate statement of power and wealth for this house to ignore such precautions, its doors and windows being sealed only against the omnipresent dust. But this room embodied a statement far more significant than the lack of water seals on outer doors. She estimated that this pleasure room used water enough to support 1,000 persons on Arrakis, possibly more. Jessica moved along the window, continuing to stare into the room. The move brought into view a metallic surface at table height beside the fountain, and she glimpsed a white notepad and stylus there, partly concealed by an overhanging fan leaf. She crossed to the table, noted Howat's day signs on it, studied a message written on the pad. To the Lady Jessica, may this place give you as much pleasure as it has given me. Please permit the room to convey a lesson we learned from the same teachers. The proximity of a desirable thing tempts one to overindulgence. On that path lies danger. My kindest wishes, Margot, Lady Fenring. Jessica nodded, remembering that Leto had referred to the Emperor's former proxy here as Count Fenring. But the hidden message of the note demanded immediate attention, couched as it was in a way to inform her the writer was another Bene Gesserit. A bitter thought touched Jessica in passing. The Count married his lady. Even as this thought flicked through her mind, she was bending to seek out the hidden message. It had to be there. The visible note contained the code phrase every Bene Gesserit not bound by a school injunction was required to give another Bene Gesserit when conditions demanded it. On that path lies danger. Jessica felt the back of the note, rubbed the surface for coded dots. Nothing. The edge of the pad came under her seeking fingers. Nothing. She replaced the pad where she had found it, feeling a sense of urgency. Something in the position of the pad? She wondered. But Howat had been over this room, doubtless had moved the pad. She looked at the leaf above the pad. The leaf! She brushed a finger along the undersurface, along the edge, along the stem. It was there. Her fingers detected the subtle, coded dots, scanned them in a single passage. Your son and the Duke are in immediate danger. A bedroom has been designed to attract your son. The H loaded it with death traps to be discovered, leaving one that may escape detection. Jessica put down the urge to run back to Paul. The full message had to be learned. Her fingers sped over the dots. I do not know the exact nature of the menace, but it has something to do with a bed. The threat to your Duke involves defection of a trusted companion or lieutenant. The H planned to give you as gift to a minion. To the best of my knowledge, this conservatory is safe. Forgive that I cannot tell more. My sources are few, as my count is not in the pay of the H. In haste, M.F. Jessica thrust the leaf aside, whirled to dash back to Paul. In that instant, the airlock door slammed open. Paul jumped through it, holding something in his right hand, slammed the door behind him. He saw his mother, pushed through the leaves to her, glanced at the fountain, thrust his hand and the thing it clutched under the falling water. "Paul!" She grabbed his shoulder, staring at the hand. "What is that?" He spoke casually, but she caught the effort behind the tone. "Hunter-seeker. Caught it in my room and smashed its nose. But I want to be sure. Water should short it out." "Immerse it," she commanded. He obeyed. Presently she said, "Withdraw your hand. Leave the thing in the water." He brought out his hand, shook water from it, staring at the quiescent metal in the fountain. Jessica broke off a plant stem, prodded the deadly sliver. It was dead. She dropped the stem into the water, looked at Paul. His eyes studied the room with a searching intensity that she recognized, the B.G. way. "This place could conceal anything," he said. "I've reason to believe it's safe," she said. "My room was supposed to be safe too. Howard said it was a hunter-seeker," she reminded him. "That means someone inside the house to operate it. Seeker control beams have a limited range. The thing could have been spirited in here after Howard's investigation." But she thought of the message of the leaf. Defection of a trusted companion or lieutenant. Not Howard, surely. Oh, surely not Howard. "Howard's men are searching the house right now," he said. "That seeker almost got the old woman who came to wake me." "The shut-out Mapes," Jessica said, remembering the encounter at the stairs. "A summons from your father to—" "That can wait," Paul said. "Why do you think this room's safe?" She pointed to the note, explained about it. He relaxed slightly. But Jessica remained inwardly tense, thinking, a hunter-seeker. Merciful Mother. It took all her training to prevent a fit of hysterical trembling. Paul spoke matter-of-factly. "It's the Harkonnens, of course. We shall have to destroy them." A rapping sounded at the airlock door, the code knock of one of Howard's corps. "Come in," Paul called. The door swung wide, and a tall man in a tradie's uniform, with a Howard insignia on his cap, leaned into the room. "There you are, sir," he said. "The housekeeper said you'd be here." He glanced around the room. "We found a cairn in the cellar and caught a man in it. He had a seeker console." "I'll want to take part in the interrogation," Jessica said. "Sorry, my lady. We messed him up catching him. He died." "Nothing to identify him?" she asked. "We found nothing yet, my lady." "Was he an Arakeen native?" Paul asked. Jessica nodded at the astuteness of the question. "He has the native look," the man said. "Put into that cairn more than a month ago, by the look, and left there to await our coming. Stone and mortar where he came through into the cellar were untouched when we inspected the place yesterday. I'll stake my reputation on it." "No one questions your thoroughness," Jessica said. "I question it, my lady. We should have used sonic probes down there." "I presume that's what you're doing now," Paul said. "Yes, sir." "Send word to my father that we'll be delayed." "At once, sir." He glanced at Jessica. "It's Howard's order that under such circumstances as these, the young master be guarded in a safe place." Again his eyes swept the room. "What of this place?" "I've reason to believe it's safe," she said. "Both Howard and I have inspected it." "Then I'll mount guard outside here, milady, until we've been over the house once more." He bowed, touched his cap to Paul, backed out and swung the door closed behind him. Paul broke the sudden silence, saying, "Had we better go over the house later ourselves? Your eyes might see things others would miss." "This wing was the only place I hadn't examined," she said. "I put it off to last because—" "Because Howard gave it his personal attention," he said. She darted a quick look at his face, questioning. "Do you distrust Howard?" she asked. "No, but he's getting old. He's overworked. We could take some of the load from him." "That'd only shame him and impair his efficiency," she said. "A stray insect won't be able to wander into this wing after he hears about this. He'll be shamed that—" "We must take our own measures," he said. "Howard has served 3 generations of Atreides with honor," she said. "He deserves every respect and trust we can pay him, many times over." Paul said, "When my father is bothered by something you've done, he says, 'Bene Gesserit,' like a swear word." "And what is it about me that bothers your father?" "When you argue with him." "You are not your father, Paul." And Paul thought, "It'll worry her, but I must tell her what that Mapes woman said about a traitor among us." "What are you holding back?" Jessica asked. "This isn't like you, Paul." He shrugged, recounted the exchange with Mapes. And Jessica thought of the message of the leaf. She came to a sudden decision, showed Paul the leaf, told him its message. "My father must learn of this at once," he said. "I'll radiograph it in code and get it off." "No," she said. "You will wait until you can see him alone. As few as possible must learn about it." "Do you mean we should trust no one?" "There's another possibility," she said. "This message may have been meant to get to us. The people who gave it to us may believe it's true, but it may be that the only purpose was to get this message to us." Paul's face remained sturdily sombre. "To sow distrust and suspicion in our ranks, to weaken us that way," he said. "You must tell your father privately, and caution him about this aspect of it," she said. "I understand." She turned to the tall reach of filter glass, stared out to the southwest where the sun of Arrakis was sinking, a yellowed ball above the cliffs. Paul turned with her, said, "I don't think it's Howard either. Is it possible it's Yui?" "He's not a lieutenant or companion," she said. "And I can assure you, he hates the Harkonnens as bitterly as we do." Paul directed his attention to the cliffs, thinking, and it couldn't be Gurney. Or Duncan. Could it be one of the sub-lieutenants? Impossible. They're all from families that have been loyal to us for generations, for good reason. Jessica rubbed her forehead, sensing her own fatigue. So much peril here. She looked out at the filter-yellowed landscape, studying it. Beyond the ducal grounds stretched a high-fenced storage yard, lines of spice silos in it with stilt-legged watchtowers standing around it like so many startled spiders. She could see at least 20 storage yards of silos reaching out to the cliffs of the shield wall. Silos repeated, stuttering across the basin. Slowly, the filtered sun buried itself beneath the horizon. Stars leaped out. She saw one bright star so low on the horizon that it twinkled with a clear, precise rhythm, a trembling of light. Blink, 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 blink. Paul stirred beside her in the dusky room. But Jessica concentrated on that single bright star, realizing that it was too low, that it must come from the shield wall cliffs. Someone signaling. She tried to read the message, but it was in no code she had ever learned. Other lights had come on down on the plain beneath the cliffs, little yellows spaced out against blue darkness, and one light off to their left grew brighter, began to wink back at the cliff very fast, blink, squirt, glimmer, blink, and it was gone. The false star in the cliff winked out immediately. Signals. and they filled her with premonition. Why were lights used to signal across the basin? She asked herself. Why couldn't they use the communications network? The answer was obvious. The communinet was certain to be tapped now by agents of the Duke Leto. Light signals could only mean that messages were being sent between his enemies, between Harkonnen agents. There came a tapping at the door behind them, and the voice of Howard's man. "All clear, sir, milady. Time to be getting the young master to his father."
It is said that the Duke Leto blinded himself to the perils of Arrakis, that he walked heedlessly into the pit. Would it not be more likely to suggest he had lived so long in the presence of extreme danger, he misjudged a change in its intensity? Or is it possible he deliberately sacrificed himself that his son might find a better life? All evidence indicates the Duke was a man not easily hoodwinked. From Muad'Dib, Family Commentaries by the Princess Irulan.
The Duke Leto Atreides leaned against the parapet of the landing control tower outside Arrakeen. The night's first moon, an oblate silver coin, hung well above the southern horizon. Beneath it, the jagged cliffs of the shield wall shone like parched icing through a dust haze. To his left, the lights of Arrakeen glowed in the haze, yellow, white, blue. He thought of the notices posted now above his signature all through the populous places of the planet. "Our sublime Padishah Emperor has charged me to take possession of this planet and end all dispute." The ritualistic formality of it touched him with a feeling of loneliness. Who was fooled by that fatuous legalism? Not the Fremen, certainly, nor the Houses Minor, who controlled the interior trade of Arrakis, and were Harkonnen creatures almost to a man. "They have tried to take the life of my son." The rage was difficult to suppress. He saw lights of a moving vehicle coming toward the landing field from Arrakeen. He hoped it was the guard and troop carrier bringing Paul. The delay was galling, even though he knew it was prompted by caution on the part of Howard's lieutenant. "They have tried to take the life of my son." He shook his head to drive out the angry thoughts, glanced back at the field where 5 of his own frigates were posted around the rim like monolithic sentries. Better a cautious delay than... The lieutenant was a good one, he reminded himself. A man marked for advancement, completely loyal. Our sublime Padishah Emperor. If the people of this decadent garrison city could only see the Emperor's private note to his noble Duke, the disdainful allusions to veiled men and women. But what else is one to expect of barbarians, whose dearest dream is to live outside the ordered security of the Farfraluchas? The Duke felt in this moment that his own dearest dream was to end all class distinctions and never again think of deadly order. He looked up and out of the dust at the unwinking stars, thought, "Around one of those little lights circles Caladan, but I'll never again see my home." The longing for Caladan was a sudden pain in his breast. He felt that it did not come from within himself, but that it reached out to him from Caladan. He could not bring himself to call this dry wasteland of Arrakis his home, and he doubted he ever would. "I must mask my feelings," he thought, "for the boy's sake. If ever he's to have a home, this must be it. I may think of Arrakis as a hell I've reached before death, but he must find here that which will inspire him. There must be something." A wave of self-pity, immediately despised and rejected, swept through him, and for some reason he found himself recalling 2 lines from a poem Gurney Halleck often repeated. "My lungs taste the air of time, blown past falling sands." Well, Gurney would find plenty of falling sands here, the Duke thought. The central wastelands beyond those moon-frosted cliffs were desert, barren rock, dunes and blowing dust, an uncharted, dry wilderness with here and there along its rim, and perhaps scattered through it, knots of Fremen. If anything could buy a future for the Atreides line, the Fremen just might do it. Provided the Harkonnens hadn't managed to infect even the Fremen with their poisonous schemes. "They have tried to take the life of my son." A scraping metal racket vibrated through the tower, shook the parapet beneath his arms. Blast shutters dropped in front of him, blocking the view. Shuttles coming in, he thought. Time to go down and get to work. He turned to the stairs behind him, headed down to the big assembly room, trying to remain calm as he descended, to prepare his face for the coming encounter. The men were already boiling in from the field when he reached the yellow-domed room. They carried their space bags over their shoulders, shouting and roistering like students returning from vacation.
"Hey, feel that under your dogs? That's gravity, man."
"How many G's does this place pull? Feels heavy."
9/10 of a G by the book.
The crossfire of thrown words filled the big room.
Did you get a good look at this hole on the way down? Where's all the loot this place is supposed to have?
The Harkonnens took it with them.
Me for a hot shower and a soft bed.
Haven't you heard, stupid? No showers down here. You scrub your ass with sand.
Hey, can it? The Duke.
The Duke stepped out of the stair entry into a suddenly silent room. Gurney Halleck strode along at the point of the crowd, bag over one shoulder, the neck of his 9-string balisette clutched in the other hand. They were long-fingered hands with big thumbs, full of tiny movements that drew such delicate music from the balisette. The Duke watched Halleck, admiring the ugly lump of a man, noting the glass-splinter eyes with their gleam of savage understanding. Here was a man who lived outside the Faufreluches while obeying their every precept. What was it Paul had called him? Gurney the Valorous. Halleck's wispy blonde hair trailed across barren spots on his head. His wide mouth was twisted into a pleasant sneer, and the scar of the ink-vine whip slashed across his jawline seemed to move with a life of its own. His whole air was of casual, shoulder-set capability. He came up to the Duke, bowed.
"Gurney."
"My lord."
He gestured with the balisette toward the men in the room.
"This is the last of them. I'd have preferred coming in with the first wave, but—"
"There are still some Harkonnens for you. Step aside with me, Gurney, where we may talk."
"Yours to command, my lord."
They moved into an alcove beside a coil-slot water machine, while the men stirred restlessly in the big room. Halleck dropped his bag into a corner, kept his grip on the balisette.
"How many men can you let Hawat have?"
"Is Thufir in trouble, sire?"
"He's lost only 2 agents, but his advance men gave us an excellent line on the entire Harkonnen setup here. If we move fast, we may gain a measure of security, the breathing space we require. He wants as many men as you can spare, men who won't balk at a little knife work."
"I can let him have 300 of my best. Where shall I send them?"
"To the main gate. Hawat has an agent there waiting to take them."
"Shall I get about it at once, sire?"
"In a moment. We have another problem. The field commandant will hold the shuttle here until dawn on a pretext. The guild highliner that brought us is going on about its business, and the shuttle is supposed to make contact with a cargo ship taking up a load of spice."
"Our spice, my lord?"
"Our spice. But the shuttle also will carry some of the spice hunters from the old regime. They've opted to leave with the change of fief, and the judge of the change is allowing it. These are valuable workers, Gurney, about 800 of them. Before the shuttle leaves, you must persuade some of those men to enlist with us."
"How strong a persuasion, sire?"
"I want their willing cooperation, Gurney. Those men have experience and skills we need. The fact that they're leaving suggests they're not part of the Harkonnen machine. Hawat believes there could be some bad ones planted in the group, but he sees assassins in every shadow."
"Thufir has found some very productive shadows in his time, my lord."
"And there are some he hasn't found. But I think planting sleepers in this outgoing crowd would show too much imagination for the Harkonnens."
"Possibly, sire. Where are these men?"
"Down on the lower level in a waiting room. I suggest you go down and play a tune or two to soften their minds, then turn on the pressure. You may offer positions of authority to those who qualify, Offer 20% higher wages than they received under the Harkonnens.
No more than that, sire? I know the Harkonnen pay scales, and to men with their termination pay in their pockets and the wanderlust on them, well, sire, 20% would hardly seem proper inducement to stay.
Then use your own discretion in particular cases. Just remember that the treasury isn't bottomless. Hold it to 20% whenever you can. We particularly need spice drivers, weather scanners, dune men, any with open sand experience.
I understand, sire. They shall come all for violence. Their faces shall sup up as the east wind, and they shall gather the captivity of the sand.
A very moving quotation. Turn your crew over to a lieutenant. Have him give a short drill on water discipline, then bed the men down for the night in the barracks adjoining the field. Field personnel will direct them. And don't forget the men for Hawat.
300 of the best, sire.
Gurney took up his space bag.
Where shall I report to you when I've completed my chores?
I've taken over a council room topside here. We'll hold staff there. I want to arrange a new planetary dispersal order with armored squads going out first.
Halleck stopped in the act of turning away, caught Leto's eye.
Are you anticipating that kind of trouble, sire? I thought there was a judge of the change here.
Both open battle and secret. There'll be blood aplenty spilled here before we're through.
And the water which thou takest out of the river shall become blood upon the dry land.
Hurry back, Gurney.
Very good, my lord. Behold, as a wild ass in the desert, go I forth to my work.
The whip scar rippled to his grin. He turned, strode to the center of the room, paused to relay his orders, hurried on through the men. Leto shook his head at the retreating back. Halleck was a continual amazement, a head full of songs, quotations, and flowery phrases, and the heart of an assassin when it came to dealing with the Harkonnens. Presently, Leto took a leisurely diagonal course across to the lift, acknowledging salutes with a casual hand wave. He recognized a propaganda corpsman, stopped to give him a message that could be relayed to the men through channels. Those who had brought their women would want to know the women were safe and where they could be found. The others would wish to know that the population here appeared to boast more women than men. The Duke slapped the propaganda man on the arm, a signal that the message had top priority to be put out immediately, then continued across the room. He nodded to the men, smiled, traded pleasantries with a subaltern. Command must always look confident, he thought. All that faith riding on your shoulders, while you sit in the critical seat and never show it. He breathed a sigh of relief when the lift swallowed him, and he could turn and face the impersonal doors. They have tried to take the life of my son.
Over the exit of the Erakeen landing field, crudely carved as though with a poor instrument, there was an inscription that Muad'Dib was to repeat many times. He saw it that first night on Arrakis, having been brought to the ducal command post to participate in his father's first full staff conference. The words of the inscription were a plea to those leaving Arrakis, but they fell with dark import on the eyes of a boy who had just escaped a close brush with death. They said, "O you who know what we suffer here, do not forget us in your prayers." From Manual of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan.
The whole theory of warfare is calculated risk, the Duke said. But when it comes to risking your own family, the element of calculation gets submerged in other things. He knew he wasn't holding in his anger as well as he should, and he turned, strode down the length of the long table and back. The Duke and Paul were alone in the conference room at the landing field. It was an empty-sounding room, furnished only with a long table, old-fashioned three-legged chairs around it, and a map board and projector at one end. Paul sat at the table near the map board. He had told his father the experience with a hunter-seeker and given the reports that a traitor threatened him. The Duke stopped across from Paul, pounded the table. "Howard told me that house was secure!" Paul spoke hesitantly. I was angry too, at first, and I blamed Howard. But the threat came from outside the house. It was simple, clever, and direct, and it would have succeeded were it not for the training given me by you and many others, including Howard. Are you defending him? The Duke demanded. Yes. He's getting old. That's it. He should be... He's wise with much experience, Paul said. How many of Howard's mistakes can you recall? I should be the one defending him, the Duke said. Not you. Paul smiled. Leto sat down at the head of the table, put a hand over his son's. You've matured lately, son. He lifted his hand. It gladdens me. He matched his son's smile. Howard will punish himself. He'll direct more anger against himself over this than both of us together could pour on him. Paul glanced toward the darkened windows beyond the map board, looked at the night's blackness. Room lights reflected from a balcony railing out there. He saw movement and recognized the shape of a guard in Atreides uniform. Paul looked back at the white wall behind his father, then down to the shiny surface of the table, seeing his own hands clenched into fists there. The door opposite the Duke banged open. Thufir Hawat strode through it, looking older and more leathery than ever. He paced down the length of the table, stopped at attention, facing Leto. "My lord," he said, speaking to a point over Leto's head, "I have just learned how I failed you. It becomes necessary that I tender my resignation." "Oh, sit down and stop acting the fool," the Duke said. He waved the chair across from Paul. "If you made a mistake, it was in overestimating the Harkonnens. Their simple minds came up with a simple trick. We didn't count on simple tricks. And my son has been at great pains to point out to me that he came through this largely because of your training. You didn't fail there." He stabbed the back of the empty chair. "Sit down, I say." Hawat sank into the chair. "But I'll hear no more of it," the Duke said. "The incident is past. We have more pressing business. Where are the others?" "I asked them to wait outside while I... Call them in." Hawat looked into Leto's eyes. "Sire, I know who my true friends are, Thufir," the Duke said. "Call in the men." Hawat swallowed. "At once, my lord." He swiveled in the chair, called to the open door. "Gurney, bring them in." Halleck led the file of men into the room, the staff officers looking grimly serious, followed by the younger aides and specialists, an air of eagerness among them. Brief scuffing sounds echoed around the room as the men took seats. A faint smell of rachag stimulant wafted down the table. "There's coffee for those who want it," the Duke said. He looked over his men, thinking, "They're a good crew. A man could do far worse for this kind of war." He waited while coffee was brought in from the adjoining room and served, noting the tiredness in some of the faces. Presently he put on his mask of quiet efficiency, stood up, and commanded their attention with a knuckle rap against the table. "Well, gentlemen," he said, "our civilization appears to have fallen so deeply into the habit of invasion that we cannot even obey a simple order of the Imperium without the old ways cropping up." Dry chuckles sounded around the table, and Paul realized that his father had said the precisely correct thing, in precisely the correct tone to lift the mood here. Even the hint of fatigue in his voice was right. "I think first we'd better learn if Thufir has anything to add to his report on the Fremen," the Duke said. "Thufir?" Hawat glanced up. "I've some economic matters to go into after my general report, sire, but I can say now that the Fremen appear more and more to be the allies we need. They're waiting now to see if they can trust us, but they appear to be dealing openly. They've sent us a gift, still suits of their own manufacture, maps of certain desert areas surrounding strong points the Harkonnens left behind." He glanced down at the table. "Their intelligence reports have proved completely reliable and have helped us considerably in our dealings with the Judge of the Change. They've also sent some incidental things, jewellery for the Lady Jessica, spice liquor, candy, medicinals. My men are processing the lot right now. There appears to be no trickery." "You like these people, Thufir?" asked a man down the table. Hawat turned to face his questioner. "Duncan Idaho says they're to be admired." Paul glanced at his father, back to Howard, ventured a question. "Have you any new information on how many Fremen there are?" Howard looked at Paul. "From food processing and other evidence, Idaho estimates the cave complex he visited consisted of some 10,000 people all told. Their leader said he ruled a CH of 2,000 hearths. We've reason to believe there are a great many such CH communities. All seem to give their allegiance to someone called Liet." "That's something new," Leto said. "It could be an error on my part, sire. There are things to suggest this Liet may be a local deity." Another man down the table cleared his throat, asked, "Is it certain they deal with the smugglers?" "A smuggler caravan left this CH while Idaho was there, carrying a heavy load of spice. They used pack beasts and indicated they faced an 18-day journey." "It appears," the Duke said, "that the smugglers have redoubled their operations during this period of unrest. This deserves some careful thought. We shouldn't worry too much about unlicensed frigates working off our planet. It's always done. But have them completely outside our observation, that's not good." "You have a plan, sir?" Howard asked. The Duke looked at Halleck. "Gunny, I want you to head a delegation, an embassy if you will, to contact these romantic businessmen. Tell them I'll ignore their operations as long as they give me a ducal tithe. Howard here estimates that graft and extra fighting men heretofore required in their operations have been costing them 4 times that amount." "What if the Emperor gets wind of this?" Halleck asked. "He's very jealous of his chome profits, my lord." Leto smiled. "We'll bank the entire tithe openly in the name of Shaddam IV, and deduct it legally from our levy support costs. Let the Harkonnens fight that. And we'll be ruining a few more of the locals who grew fat under the Harkonnen system. No more graft." A grin twisted Halleck's face. "Ah, my lord, a beautiful low blow. Would that I could see the Baron's face when he learns of this." The Duke turned to Howard. "Thufir, did you get those account books you said you could buy?" "Yes, my lord. They're being examined in detail even now. I've skimmed them, though, and can give a first approximation." "Give it, then." "The Harkonnens took 10 billion Solaris out of here every 330 standard days." A muted gasp ran around the table. Even the younger aides who had been betraying some boredom sat up straighter and exchanged wide-eyed looks. Halleck murmured, "For they shall suck of the abundance of the seas and of the treasure hid in the sand." "You see, gentlemen," Leto said, "is there anyone here so naive he believes the Harkonnens have quietly packed up and walked away from all this merely because the Emperor ordered it?" There was a general shaking of heads, murmurous agreement. "We will have to take it at the point of the sword," Leto said. He turned to Howard. "This would be a good point to report on equipment. How many sand crawlers, harvesters, spice factories, and supporting equipment have they left us?" "A full complement, as it says in the Imperial Inventory, audited by the Judge of the Change, my lord," Howard said. He gestured for an aide to pass him a folder, opened the folder on the table in front of him. "They neglect to mention that less than half the crawlers are operable, that only about a third have carryalls to fly them to spice sands, that everything the Harkonnens left us is ready to break down and fall apart. We'll be lucky to get half the equipment into operation, and luckier yet if a fourth of it's still working 6 months from now." "Pretty much as we expected," Leto said. "What's the firm estimate on basic equipment?" Howard glanced at his folder. "About 930 harvester factories that can be sent out in a few days. About 6,250 ornithopters for survey, scouting, and weather observation. Carryalls a little under 1,000. Halleck said, "Wouldn't it be cheaper to reopen negotiations with the Guild for permission to orbit a frigate as a weather satellite?" The Duke looked at Howard. "Nothing new there, eh, Thufir?" "We must pursue other avenues for now," Howard said. "The Guild agent wasn't really negotiating with us. He was merely making it plain, one mentor to another, that the price was out of our reach and would remain so no matter how long a reach we develop. Our task is to find out why, before we approach him again." One of Halleck's aides down the table swiveled in his chair, snapped, "There's no justice in this." "Justice?" The Duke looked at the man. Who asks for justice? We make our own justice. We make it here on Arrakis, win or die. Do you regret casting your lot with us, sir?" The man stared at the Duke, then, "No, sire. You couldn't turn, and I could do naught but follow you. Forgive the outburst, but—" He shrugged. "We must all feel bitter at times." "Bitterness I understand," the Duke said. "But let us not rail about justice as long as we have arms and the freedom to use them. Do any of the rest of you harbour bitterness? If so, let it out. This is friendly counsel where any man may speak his mind." Halleck stirred, said, "I think what rankles, sire, is that we've had no volunteers from the other great houses. They address you as Leto the Just and promise eternal friendship, but only as long as it doesn't cost them anything." "They don't know yet who's going to win this exchange," the Duke said. "Most of the houses have grown fat by taking few risks. One cannot truly blame them for this. One can only despise them." He looked at Howard. "We were discussing equipment. Would you care to project a few examples to familiarize the men with this machinery?" Howard nodded, gestured to an aide at the projector. A Solido Tri-D projection appeared on the table surface about a third of the way down from the Duke. Some of the men farther along the table stood up to get a better look at it. Paul leaned forward, staring at the machine. Scaled against the tiny projected human figures around it, the thing was about 120 meters long and about 40 meters wide. It was basically a long, bug-like body moving on independent sets of wide tracks. "This is a harvester factory," Howard said. "We chose one in good repair for this projection. There's one dragline outfit that came in with the first team of Imperial ecologists, though, and it's still running, although I don't know how or why." "If that's the one they call Old Maria, it belongs in a museum," an aide said. "I think the Harkonnens kept it as a punishment job, a threat hanging over their workers' heads. Be good or you'll be assigned to Old Maria." Chuckles sounded around the table. Paul held himself apart from the humour, his attention focused on the projection and the question that filled his mind. He pointed to the image on the table, said, "Thufir, are there sandworms big enough to swallow that whole?" Quick silence settled on the table. The Duke cursed under his breath, then thought, "No, they have to face the realities here." "There are worms in the deep desert could take this entire factory in one gulp," Howard said. "Up here, closer to the shield wall where most of the spicing's done, there are plenty of worms that could cripple this factory and devour it at their leisure." "Why don't we shield them?" Paul asked. "According to Idaho's report," Howard said, "shields are dangerous in the desert. A body-sized shield will call every worm for hundreds of meters around. It appears to drive them into a killing frenzy. We've the Fremen word on this and no reason to doubt it. Idaho saw no evidence of shield equipment at the CH. "None at all?" Paul asked. "It'd be pretty hard to conceal that kind of thing among several thousand people," Howard said. "Idaho had free access to every part of the CH. He saw no shields or any indication of their use." "It's a puzzle," the Duke said. "The Harkonnens certainly used plenty of shields here," Howard said. "They had repair depots in every garrison village, and their accounts show a heavy expenditure for shield replacements and parts." "Could the Fremen have a way of nullifying shields?" Paul asked. "It doesn't seem likely," Howard said. "It's theoretically possible, of course. A Shire-sized static countercharge is supposed to do the trick, but no one's ever been able to put it to the test." "We'd have heard about it before now," Halleck said. "The smugglers have close contact with the Fremen, and would have acquired such a device if it were available, and they'd have had no inhibitions against marketing an off-planet." "I don't like an unanswered question of this importance," Leto said. "Thufir, I want you to give top priority to solution of this problem." "We're already working on it, my lord." He cleared his throat. Idaho did say one thing. He said you couldn't mistake the Fremen attitude toward shields. He said they were mostly amused by them." The Duke frowned, then, "The subject under discussion is spicing equipment." Howard gestured to his aide at the projector. The Solido image of the harvester factory was replaced by a projection of a winged device that dwarfed the images of human figures around it. "This is a carryall," Howard said. "It's essentially a large thopter whose sole function is to deliver a factory to spice-rich sands, then to rescue the factory when a sandworm appears. They always appear. Harvesting the spice is a process of getting in and getting out with as much as possible." "Admirably suited to Harkonnen morality," the Duke said. Laughter was abrupt and too loud. An ornithopter replaced the carryall in the projection focus. "These thopters are fairly conventional," Howard said. "Major modifications give them extended range. Extra care has been used in sealing essential areas against sand and dust. Only about 1 in 30 is shielded, possibly discarding the shield generator's weight for greater range." "I don't like this de-emphasis on shields," the Duke muttered. And he thought, is this the Harkonnen secret? Does it mean we won't even be able to escape on shielded frigates if all goes against us? He shook his head sharply to drive out such thoughts, said, "Let's get to the working estimate. What'll our profit figure be?" Howard turned 2 pages in his notebook. "After assessing the repairs and operable equipment, we've worked out a first estimate on operating costs. It's based naturally on a depreciated figure for a clear safety margin." He closed his eyes in Mentat semi-trance, said, "Under the Harkonnens, maintenance and salaries were held to 14%. We'll be lucky to make it at 30% at first. With reinvestment and growth factors accounted for, including the CHOAM percentage and military costs, our profit margin will be reduced to a very narrow 6 or 7% until we can replace worn-out equipment. We then should be able to boost it up to 12 or 15% where it belongs." He opened his eyes. "Unless my lord wishes to adopt Harkonnen methods." "We are working for a solid and permanent planetary base," the Duke said. "We have to keep a large percentage of the people happy, especially the Fremen." "Most especially the Fremen," Howard agreed. "Our supremacy on Caladan," the Duke said, "depended on sea and air power. Here we must develop something I choose to call desert power. This may include air power, but it's possible it may not. I call your attention to the lack of thopter shields." He shook his head. "The Harkonnens relied on turnover from off-planet for some of their key personnel. We don't dare. Each new lot would have its quota of provocateurs." "Then we'll have to be content with far less profit and reduced harvest," Howard said. "Our output the first 2 seasons should be down 1/3 from the Harkonnen average." "There it is," the Duke said. "Exactly as we expected. We'll have to move fast with the Fremen. I'd like 5 full battalions of Fremen troops before the first CHOAM audit." "That's not much time, sir," Howard said. "We don't have much time, as you well know. They'll be here with Sardaukar disguised as Harkonnens at the first opportunity. How many do you think they'll ship in, Thufir?" 4 or 5 battalions all told, sire. No more. Guild troop transport costs being what they are." "Then 5 battalions of Fremen plus our own forces ought to do it. Let us have a few captive Sardaukar to parade in front of the Landsrat Council, and matters will be much different, profits or no profits." "We'll do our best, sire." Paul looked at his father, back to Howard, suddenly conscious of the Mentat's great age, aware that the old man had served 3 generations of Atreides. Aged. It showed in the rheumy shine of the brown eyes, in the cheeks cracked and burned by exotic weathers, in the rounded curve of the shoulders and the thin set of his lips, with the cranberry-coloured stain of sappho juice. So much depends on one aged man, Paul thought. "We're presently in a war of assassins," the Duke said, "but it has not achieved full scale. Thufir, what's the condition of the Harkonnen machine here?" "We've eliminated 259 of their key people, my lord. No more than 3 Harkonnen cells remain. Perhaps 100 people in all." "These Harkonnen creatures you eliminated," the Duke said, "were they propertied?" "Most were well situated, my lord. In the entrepreneur class." "I want you to forge certificates of allegiance over the signatures of each of them," the Duke said. "File copies with the judge of the change. We'll take the legal position that they stayed under false allegiance. Confiscate their property. Take everything, turn out their families, strip them, and make sure the Crown gets its 10%. It must be entirely legal." Thufir smiled, revealing red-stained teeth beneath the carmine lips. "A move worthy of your grandsire, my lord. It shames me that I didn't think of it first." Halleck frowned across the table, noticing a deep scowl on Paul's face. The others were smiling and nodding. "It's wrong," Paul thought. "This'll only make the others fight all the harder. They've nothing to gain by surrendering." He knew the actual no-holds-barred convention that ruled in Canley, but this was the sort of move that could destroy them, even as it gave them victory. "I have been a stranger in a strange land," Halleck quoted. Paul stared at him, recognizing the quotation from the O.C. Bible, wondering, does Gurney, too, wish an end to devious plots? The Duke glanced at the darkness out the windows, looked back at Halleck. "Gurney, how many of those sand workers did you persuade to stay with us?" 286 in all, sire. I think we should take them and consider ourselves lucky. They're all in useful categories." "No more?" The Duke pursed his lips. Then, "Well, pass the word along to—" A disturbance at the door interrupted him. Duncan Idaho came through the guard there, hurried down the length of the table and bent over the Duke's ear. Leto waved him back, said, "Speak out, Duncan. You can see this is strategy stuff." Paul studied Idaho, marking the feline movements, the swiftness of reflex that made him such a difficult weapons teacher to emulate. Idaho's dark, round face turned toward Paul. The cave-sitter eyes gave no hint of recognition, but Paul recognized the mask of serenity over excitement. Idaho looked down the length of the table, said, "We've taken a force of Harkonnen mercenaries disguised as Fremen. The Fremen themselves sent us a courier to warn of the false band. In the attack, however, we found the Harkonnens had waylaid the Fremen courier, badly wounded him. We were bringing him here for treatment by our medics when he died. I'd seen how badly off the man was and stopped to do what I could. I surprised him in the attempt to throw something away." Idaho glanced down at Leto. "A knife, my lord. A knife, the like of which you've never seen." "Chris knife?" someone asked. "No doubt of it," Idaho said. "Milky white and glowing with a light of its own like." He reached into his tunic, brought out a sheath with a black ridged handle protruding from it. "Keep that blade in its sheath." The voice came from the open door at the end of the room, a vibrant and penetrating voice that brought them all up, staring. A tall, robed figure stood in the door, barred by the crossed swords of the guard. A light tan robe completely enveloped the man except for a gap in the hood and black veil that exposed eyes of total blue. No white in them at all. "Let him enter," Idaho whispered. "Pass that man," the Duke said. The guards hesitated, then lowered their swords. The man swept into the room, stood across from the Duke. "This is Stilgar, chief of the CH I visited, leader of those who warned us of the false band," Idaho said. "Welcome, sir," Leto said. "And why shouldn't we unsheath this blade?" Stilgar glanced at Idaho, said, "You observed the customs of cleanliness and honor among us. I would permit you to see the blade of the man you befriended." His gaze swept the others in the room. "But I do not know these others. Would you have them defile an honorable weapon?" "I am the Duke Leto," the Duke said. "Would you permit me to see this blade?" "I'll permit you to earn the right to unsheath it," Stilgar said. And as a mutter of protest sounded around the table, he raised a thin, darkly veined hand. "I remind you, this is the blade of one who befriended you." In the waiting silence, Paul studied the man, sensing the aura of power that radiated from him. He was a leader, a Fremen leader. A man near the centre of the table across from Paul muttered, "Who's he to tell us what rights we have on Arrakis?" "It is said that the Duke Leto Atreides rules with the consent of the governed," the Fremen said. "Thus I must tell you the way it is with us. A certain responsibility falls on those who have seen a crysknife." He passed a dark glance across Idaho, They are ours. They may never leave Arrakis without our consent." Halleck and several of the others started to rise, angry expressions on their faces. Halleck said, "The Duke Leto determines whether—" "One moment, please," Leto said, and the very mildness of his voice held them. This must not get out of hand, he thought. He addressed himself to the Fremen. "Sir, I honour and respect the personal dignity of any man who respects my dignity. I am indeed indebted to you, and I always pay my debts. If it is your custom that this knife remain sheathed here, then it is so ordered, by me. And if there is any other way we may honour the man who died in our service, you have but to name it." The Fremen stared at the Duke, then slowly pulled aside his veil, revealing a thin nose and full-lipped mouth in a glistening black beard. Deliberately he bent over the end of the table, spat on its polished surface. As the men around the table started to surge to their feet, Idaho's voice boomed across the room. "Hold!" Into the sudden charged stillness, Idaho said, "We thank you, Stilgar, for the life of your body's moisture. We accept it in the spirit with which it is given." And Idaho spat on the table in front of the Duke. Aside to the Duke, he said, "Remember how precious water is here, sire. That was a token of respect." Leto sank back into his own chair, caught Paul's eye, a rueful grin on his son's face, sensed the slow relaxation of tension around the table as understanding came to his men. The Fremen looked at Idaho, said, "You measured well in my sietch, Duncan Idaho. Is there a bond on your allegiance to your duke?" "He's asking me to enlist with him, sire," Idaho said. "Would he accept a dual allegiance?" Leto asked. "You wish me to go with him, sire?" "I wish you to make your own decision in the matter," Leto said, and he could not keep the urgency out of his voice. Idaho studied the Fremen. "Would you have me under these conditions, Stilgar? There be times when I'd have to return to serve my duke." "You fight well, and you did your best for our friend," Stilgar said. He looked at Leto. "Let it be thus. The man Idaho keeps the crysknife he holds as a mark of his allegiance to us. He must be cleansed, of course, and the rites observed, but this can be done. He will be Fremen and soldier of the Atreides. There is precedent for this. Liet serves two masters." "Duncan?" Leto asked. "I understand, sir," Idaho said. "It is agreed, then," Leto said. "Your water is ours, Duncan Idaho," Stilgar said. "The body of our friend remains with your duke. His water is Atreides' water. It is a bond between us." Leto sighed, glanced at Hawat, catching the old Mentat's eye. Hawat nodded, his expression pleased. "I will await below," Stilgar said, "while Idaho makes farewell with his friends. Turok was the name of our dead friend. Remember that when it comes time to release his spirit. You are friends of Turok." Stilgar started to turn away. "Will you not stay a while?" Leto asked. The Fremen turned back, whipping his veil into place with a casual gesture, adjusting something beneath it. Paul glimpsed what looked like a thin tube before the veil settled into place. "Is there reason to stay?" the Fremen asked. "We would honour you," the Duke said. "Honour requires that I be elsewhere soon," the Fremen said. He shot another glance at Idaho, whirled and strode out past the door guards. "If the other Fremen match him, we'll serve each other well," Leto said. Idaho spoke in a dry voice. "He's a fair sample, sire. You understand what you're to do, Duncan. I'm your ambassador to the Fremen, sire. Much depends on you, Duncan. We're going to need at least 5 battalions of those people before the Sardaukar descend on us. This is going to take some doing, sire. The Fremen are a pretty independent bunch." Idaho hesitated. Then, "And, sire, there's one other thing. One of the mercenaries we knocked over was trying to get this blade from our dead Fremen friend. The mercenary says there's a Harkonnen reward of 1,000,000 Solaris for anyone who'll bring in a single crysknife. Leto's chin came up in a movement of obvious surprise. Why do they want one of those blades so badly? The knife is ground from a sandworm's tooth. It's the mark of the Fremen, sire. With it, a blue-eyed man could penetrate any sietch in the land. They'd question me unless I were known. I don't look Fremen, but— Peter de Vries, the Duke said. A man of devilish cunning, my lord, Howard said. Idaho slipped the sheathed knife beneath his tunic. Guard that knife, the Duke said. I understand, my lord. He patted the transceiver on his belt kit. I'll report as soon as possible. Thufir has my call code. Use battle language. He saluted, spun about, and hurried after the Fremen. They heard his footsteps drumming down the corridor. A look of understanding passed between Leto and Howard. They smiled. We've much to do, sir, Halleck said. And I keep you from your work, Leto said. I have the report on the advanced bases, Howard said. Shall I give it another time, sir? Will it take long? Not for a briefing. It's said among the Fremen that there were more than 200 of these advanced bases built here on Arrakis during the Desert Botanical Testing Station period. All supposedly have been abandoned, but there are reports they were sealed off before being abandoned. Equipment in them? The Duke asked. According to the reports I have from Duncan. Where are they located? Halleck asked. The answer to that question, Howard said, is invariably, Liet knows. God knows, Leto muttered. Perhaps not, sire, Howard said. You heard this Stilgar use the name. Could he have been referring to a real person? Serving two masters, Halleck said. It sounds like a religious quotation. And you should know, the Duke said. Halleck smiled. This judge of the change, Leto said, the Imperial ecologist Kynes. Wouldn't he know where those bases are? Sir, Howard cautioned, this Kynes is an Imperial servant. And he's a long way from the Emperor, Leto said. I want those bases. They'd be loaded with materials we could salvage and use for repair of our working equipment. Sire, Howard said, those bases are still legally His Majesty's fief. The weather here's savage enough to destroy anything, the Duke said. We can always blame the weather. Get this Kynes and at least find out if the bases exist. 'Twere dangerous to commandeer them, Howard said. Duncan was clear on one thing. Those bases, or the idea of them, hold some deep significance for the Fremen. We might alienate the Fremen if we took those bases. Paul looked at the faces of the men around them, saw the intensity of the way they followed every word. They appeared deeply disturbed by his father's attitude. Listen to him, father, Paul said in a low voice. He speaks truth. Sire, Howard said, those bases could give us material to repair every piece of equipment left us, yet be beyond reach for strategic reasons. It would be rash to move without greater knowledge. This Kynes has arbiter authority from the Imperium. We mustn't forget that. And the Fremen defer to him. Do it gently, then, the Duke said. I wish to know only if those bases exist. As you will, sir. Howard sat back, lowered his eyes. All right, then, the Duke said. We know what we have ahead of us. Work. We've been trained for it. We've some experience in it. We know what the rewards are, and the alternatives are clear enough. You all have your assignments. He looked at Halleck. Gurney, take care of that smuggler situation first. I shall go unto the rebellious that dwell in the dry land, Halleck intoned. Some day I'll catch that man without a quotation, and he'll look undressed, the Duke said. Chuckles echoed around the table, but Paul heard the effort in them. The Duke turned to Howard. Set up another command post for intelligence and communications on this floor, Thufir. When you have them ready, I want to see you. Howard arose, glancing around the room as though seeking support. He turned away, led the procession out of the room. The others moved hurriedly, scraping their chairs on the floor, balling up in little knots of confusion. It ended up in confusion, Paul thought. staring at the backs of the last men to leave. Always before, staff had ended on an incisive air. This meeting had just seemed to trickle out, worn down by its own inadequacies, and with an argument to top it off. For the first time, Paul allowed himself to think about the real possibility of defeat, not thinking about it out of fear or because of warnings such as that of the old Reverend Mother, but facing up to it because of his own assessment of the situation. My father is desperate, he thought. Things aren't going well for us at all. And Howard. Paul recalled how the old mentat had acted during the conference, subtle hesitations, signs of unrest. Howard was deeply troubled by something. "Best you remain here the rest of the night, son," the Duke said. "It'll be dawn soon, anyway. I'll inform your mother." He got to his feet slowly, stiffly. "Why don't you pull a few of these chairs together and stretch out on them for some rest?" "I'm not very tired, sir." "As you will." The Duke folded his hands behind him, began pacing up and down the length of the table. Like a caged animal, Paul thought. "Are you going to discuss the traitor possibility with Howard?" Paul asked. The Duke stopped across from his son, spoke to the dark windows. "We've discussed the possibility many times." "The old woman seemed so sure of herself," Paul said. "And the message, Mother—" "Precautions have been taken," the Duke said. He looked around the room, and Paul marked the hunted wildness in his father's eyes. "Remain here. There are some things about the command posts I want to discuss with Thufir." He turned, strode out of the room, nodding shortly to the door guards. Paul stared at the place where his father had stood. The space had been empty even before the Duke left the room. And he recalled the old woman's warning. For the father, nothing.
On that first day when Muad'Dib rode through the streets of Erechim with his family, some of the people along the way recalled the legends and the prophecy, and they ventured to shout, "Mahdi!" But their shout was more a question than a statement, for as yet they could only hope he was the one foretold as the Lisan al-Ghaib, the voice from the outer world. Their attention was focused, too, on the mother, because they had heard she was a Bene Gesserit, and it was obvious to them that she was like the other Lisan al-Ghaib. From Manual of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan.
The Duke found Thufir Hawat alone in the corner room to which a guard directed him. There was the sound of men setting up communications equipment in an adjoining room, but this place was fairly quiet. The Duke glanced around as Hawat arose from a paper-cluttered table. It was a green-walled enclosure with, in addition to the table, 3 suspensor chairs from which the Harkonnen H had been hastily removed, leaving an imperfect colour patch.
"The chairs are liberated, but quite safe. Where is Paul, sire?"
I left him in the conference room. I'm hoping he'll get some rest without me there to distract him.
Hawat nodded, crossed to the door to the adjoining room, closed it, shutting off the noise of static and electronic sparking.
Thufir, the Imperial and Harkonnen stockpiles of spice attract my attention.
"My lord."
The Duke pursed his lips.
Storehouses are susceptible to destruction.
He raised a hand as Hawat started to speak.
Ignore the Emperor's hoard. He'd secretly enjoy it if the Harkonnens were embarrassed. And can the Baron object if something is destroyed which he cannot openly admit that he has?
"We've few men to spare, sire."
Use some of Idaho's men. And perhaps some of the Fremen would enjoy a trip off-planet. A raid on Gaiety Prime. There are tactical advantages to such a diversion, Thufir.
"As you say, my lord."
Hawat turned away, and the Duke saw evidence of nervousness in the old man, thought, perhaps he suspects I distrust him. He must know I've private reports of traitors. Well, best quiet his fears immediately.
Thufir, since you're one of the few I can trust completely, there's another matter bears discussion. We both know how constant a watch we must keep to prevent traitors from infiltrating our forces. But I have 2 new reports.
Howard turned, stared at him, and later repeated the stories Paul had brought. Instead of bringing on the intense Mentat concentration, the reports only increased Howard's agitation. Leto studied the old man.
You've been holding something back, old friend. I should have suspected when you were so nervous during staff. What is it that was too hot to dump in front of the full conference?
Howard's sappho-stained lips were pulled into a prim, straight line with tiny wrinkles radiating into them.
My lord, I don't quite know how to broach this.
We've suffered many a scar for each other, Thufir. You know you can broach any subject with me.
Howard continued to stare at him, thinking, this is how I like him best. This is the man of honor who deserves every bit of my loyalty and service. Why must I hurt him?
Well?
It's a scrap of note. We took it from a Harkonnen courier. The note was intended for an agent named Pardee. We've good reason to believe Pardee was top man in the Harkonnen underground here. The note, it's a thing that could have great consequence or no consequence. It's susceptible to various interpretations.
What's the delicate content of this note?
A scrap of note, my lord. Incomplete. It was on mnemic film with the usual destruction capsule attached. We stopped the acid action just short of full erasure, leaving only a fragment. The fragment, however, is extremely suggestive.
Yes?
Howard rubbed at his lips.
It says, Ato will never suspect, and when the blow falls on him from a beloved hand, its source alone should be enough to destroy him. The note was under the Baron's own seal, and I've authenticated the seal.
Your suspicion is obvious.
I'd sooner cut off my arms than hurt you. My lord, what if...
The Lady Jessica. Couldn't you wring the facts out of this party?
Unfortunately, Pardee no longer was among the living when we intercepted the courier. The courier, I'm certain, did not know what he carried.
I see.
Leto shook his head, thinking, what a slimy piece of business. There can't be anything in it. I know my woman.
My lord, if...
No! There's a mistake here that...
We cannot ignore it, my lord.
She's been with me for 16 years. There have been countless opportunities for... You yourself investigated the school and the woman.
Things have been known to escape me.
It's impossible, I tell you. The Harkonnens want to destroy the Atreides line. Meaning Paul, too. They've already tried once. Could a woman conspire against her own son?
Perhaps she doesn't conspire against her son, and yesterday's attempt could have been a clever sham.
It couldn't have been a sham.
Sire, she isn't supposed to know her parentage, but what if she does know? What if she were an orphan, say, orphaned by an Atreides?
She'd have moved long before now. Poison in my drink, a stiletto at night. Who has had better opportunity?
The Harkonnens mean to destroy you, my lord. Their intent is not just to kill. There's a range of fine distinctions in Conley. This could be a work of art among vendettas.
The Duke's shoulders slumped. He closed his eyes, looking old and tired. It cannot be, he thought. The woman has opened her heart to me.
What better way to destroy me than to sow suspicion of the woman I love?
An interpretation I've considered. Still.
The Duke opened his eyes, stared at Howard, thinking, let him be suspicious. Suspicion is his trade, not mine. Perhaps if I appear to believe this, that will make another man careless.
What do you suggest?
For now, constant surveillance, my lord. She should be watched at all times. I will see it's done unobtrusively. Idaho would be the ideal choice for the job. Perhaps in a week or so we can bring him back. There's a young man we've been training in Idaho's troop who might be ideal to send to the Fremen as a replacement. He's gifted in diplomacy.
Don't jeopardize our foothold with the Fremen.
Of course not, sir.
And what about Paul?
Perhaps we could alert Dr. Yui.
Leto turned his back on Howard.
I leave it in your hands.
I shall use discretion, my lord.
At least I can count on that, Leto thought.
I will take a walk. If you need me, I'll be within the perimeter. The guard can...
My lord, before you go, I have a film clip you should read. It's a first approximation analysis on the Fremen religion. You'll recall you asked me to report on it.
The Duke paused, spoke without turning.
Will it not wait?
Of course, my lord. You asked what they were shouting, though. It was Mahdi. They directed the term at the young master. When they...
At Paul?
Yes, my lord. They've a legend here, a prophecy, that a leader will come to them, child of a Bene Gesserit, to lead them to true freedom. It follows the familiar Messiah pattern.
They think Paul is this...
They only hope, my lord.
Howard extended a film clip capsule. The Duke accepted it, thrust it into a pocket.
I'll look at it later.
Certainly, my lord.
Right now, I need time to... think.
Yes, my lord.
The Duke took a deep, sighing breath, strode out the door. He turned to his right, down the hall, began walking, hands behind his back, paying little attention to where he was. There were corridors and stairs and balconies and halls, people who saluted and stood aside for him. In time he came back to the conference room, found it dark, and Paul asleep on the table with a guard's robe thrown over him and a ditty pack for a pillow. The Duke walked softly down the length of the room and onto the balcony overlooking the landing field. A guard at the corner of the balcony, recognizing the Duke by the dim reflection of lights from the field, snapped to attention. At ease, the Duke murmured. He leaned against the cold metal of the balcony rail. A pre-dawn hush had come over the desert basin. He looked up. Straight overhead, the stars were a sequin shawl flung over blue-black. Low on the southern horizon, the night's second moon peered through a thin dust haze, an unbelieving moon that looked at him with a cynical light. As the Duke watched, the moon dipped beneath the shield wall cliffs, frosting them, and in the sudden intensity of darkness, he experienced a chill. He shivered. Anger shot through him. The Harkonnens have hindered and hounded and hunted me for the last time, he thought. They are dung heaps with village provost minds. Here I make my stand. And he thought, with a touch of sadness, I must rule with eye and claw, as the hawk among lesser birds. Unconsciously, his hand brushed the hawk emblem on his tunic. To the east, the night grew a faggot of luminous grey, then seashell opalescence that dimmed the stars. There came the long, bell-tolling movement of dawn striking across a broken horizon. It was a scene of such beauty, it caught all his attention. Some things beggar likeness, he thought. He had never imagined anything here could be as beautiful as that shattered red horizon and the purple and ochre cliffs. Beyond the landing field, where the night's faint dew had touched life into the hurried seeds of Arrakis, he saw great puddles of red blooms and, running through them, an articulate tread of violet, like giant footsteps. "It's a beautiful morning, sire," the guard said. "Yes, it is." The Duke nodded, thinking, perhaps this planet could grow on one. Perhaps it could become a good home for my son. Then he saw the human figures moving into the flower fields, sweeping them with strange scythe-like devices, dew-gatherers. Water so precious here that even the dew must be collected. And it could be a hideous place, the Duke thought.
There is probably no more terrible instant of enlightenment than the one in which you discover your father is a man with human flesh. From Collected Sayings of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan.
The Duke said, "Paul, I'm doing a hateful thing. But I must. He stood beside the portable poison snooper that had been brought into the conference room for their breakfast. The thing's sensor arms hung limply over the table, reminding Paul of some weird insect newly dead. The Duke's attention was directed out the windows at the landing field and its roiling of dust against the morning sky. Paul had a viewer in front of him containing a short film clip on Fremen religious practices. The clip had been compiled by one of Hawat's experts, and Paul found himself disturbed by the references to himself. Matif. Lisan al-Gaib. He could close his eyes and recall the shouts of the crowds. So that is what they hope, he thought. And he remembered what the old Reverend Mother had said. Kwisatz Haderach. The memories touched his feelings of terrible purpose, shading this strange world with sensations of familiarity that he could not understand. A hateful thing, the Duke said. What do you mean, sir? Leto turned, looked down at his son. Because the Harkonnens think to trick me by making me distrust your mother. And they don't know that I'd sooner distrust myself. I don't understand, sir. Again, Leto looked out the windows. The white sun was well up into its morning quadrant. Milky light picked out a boiling of dust clouds that spilled over into the blind canyons interfingering the shield wall. Slowly, speaking in a slow voice to contain his anger, the Duke explained to Paul about the mysterious note. You might just as well mistrust me, Paul said. They have to think they've succeeded, the Duke said. They must think me this much of a fool. It must look real. Even your mother may not know the sham. But, sir, why? Your mother's response must not be an act. Oh, she's capable of a supreme act, but too much rides on this. I hope to smoke out a traitor. It must seem that I've been completely cozened. She must be hurt this way that she does not suffer greater hurt. Why do you tell me, Father? Maybe I'll give it away. They'll not watch you in this thing, the Duke said. You'll keep the secret. You must. He walked to the windows, spoke without turning. This way, if anything should happen to me, you can tell her the truth. That I never doubted her. Not for the smallest instant. I should want her to know this. Paul recognized the death thoughts in his father's words, spoke quickly. Nothing's going to happen to you, sir. Be silent, son. Paul stared at his father's back, seeing the fatigue in the angle of the neck, in the line of the shoulders, in the slow movements. You're just tired, Father. I am tired, the Duke agreed. I'm morally tired. The melancholy degeneration of the great houses has afflicted me at last, perhaps, and we were such strong people once. Paul spoke in quick anger. Our house hasn't degenerated, hasn't it? The Duke turned, faced his son, revealing dark circles beneath hard eyes, a cynical twist of mouth. I should wed your mother, make her my duchess. Yet, my unwedded state gives some houses hope they may yet ally with me through their marriageable daughters, he shrugged. So, Mother has explained this to me. Nothing wins more loyalty for a leader than an air of bravura, the Duke said. I, therefore, cultivate an air of bravura. You lead well, Paul protested. You govern well. Men follow you willingly and love you. My propaganda corps is one of the finest, the Duke said. Again he turned to stare out at the basin. There's greater possibility for us here on Arrakis than the Imperium could ever suspect. Yet sometimes I think it'd have been better if we'd run for it, gone renegade. Sometimes I wish we could sink back into anonymity among the people, become less exposed to— Father! Yes, I am tired, the Duke said. Did you know we're using spice residue as raw material, and already have our own factory to manufacture film base? Sir, we mustn't run short of film base, the Duke said. Else, how could we flood village and city with our information? The people must learn how well I govern them. How would they know if we didn't tell them? You should get some rest, Paul said. Again, the Duke faced his son. Arrakis has another advantage I almost forgot to mention. Spice is in everything here. You breathe it and eat it in almost everything. And I find that this imparts a certain natural immunity to some of the most common poisons of the Assassin's Handbook. And the need to watch every drop of water puts all food production, yeast culture, hydroponics, chemovit, everything under the strictest surveillance. We cannot kill off large segments of our population with poison, and we cannot be attacked this way either. Arrakis makes us moral and ethical. Paul started to speak, but the Duke cut him off, saying, I have to have someone I can say these things to, son. He sighed, glanced back at the dry landscape where even the flowers were gone now, trampled by the dew-gatherers, wilted under the early sun. On Caladan we ruled with sea and air power, the Duke said. Here we must scrabble for desert power. This is your inheritance, Paul. What is to become of you if anything happens to me? You'll not be a renegade house, but a guerrilla house, running, hunted. Paul groped for words, could find nothing to say. He had never seen his father this despondent. To hold Arrakis, the Duke said, one is faced with decisions that may cost one his self-respect. He pointed out the window to the Atreides' green and black banner hanging limply from a staff at the edge of the landing field. That honorable banner could come to mean many evil things. Paul swallowed in a dry throat. His father's words carried futility, a sense of fatalism that left the boy with an empty feeling in his chest. The Duke took an anti-fatigue tablet from a pocket, gulped it dry. Power and fear, he said, the tools of statecraft. I must order a new emphasis on guerrilla training for you. That film clip there, they call you Mahdi, Lisan al-Gaib. As a last resort, you might capitalize on that. Paul stared at his father, watching the shoulders straighten as the tablet did its work, but remembering the words of fear and doubt. What's keeping that ecologist? The Duke muttered. I told Thufir to have him here early.